When you get to the intermediate and advanced level, it's mostly mental mistakes. Okay, we're kind of like spiraling, where it's just like snowballing, like one mistake leads to another, which leads to another. If you can just like stop and like, all right, let's just do like a story time. Let's have like a water break. What's something funny that happened this week, etc. Just to kind of like press F5 and just like mentally reset. And then, okay, now let's try and get back into this. Breathing exercises, in for 2, out for 10, and vice versa, just to like help regulate things. So meditation related practicing, like with focusing on your breathing or like belly breaths, that can really help with anxiety that comes with performing, because you're not just breathing from like the upper part of your lungs, but you're actually breathing from the full part of your lungs. Breathe in, and then you breathe in again to expand even more, and then so if like you have like a bad rep, like a student has a bad rep, teach them to do that and just like let it out. Bigger breaths than that relaxes your nervous system remarkably well, actually. And so I'd recommend doing something like that. Another thing that's more on the goofy side, we would do the set game where 2 people face each other, and they would go to set and they were not allowed to break. The first person to smile or to like laugh would lose. And so the rest of the drum line would be around them and like making goofy like sound effects or just like funny faces like right over the person's shoulder, and just like, it was basically teaching them to work on their attention, to focus more. So when we were in a lot, if like stuff happened over here, they were just focused on a point in space and focus on their playing and not what was going on elsewhere. But anything to just do like a mental reset, even if it's like, hey, let's just like stretch for a minute. Just taking a few minutes to do that is super helpful, because if all you do is just like sit there and continue to reinforce frustration, then things will just continue to spiral out of control. Before I get to the next tip, I just want to say really quickly that you can find literally thousands of hours of free drumming play-alongs and drumming tips in the link at the top of the description, or by going into my home tab of YouTube. If traditional grip was better than match grip, then why not play double traditional? Why doesn't anybody do this? I often see some people think that traditional grip means that you're an advanced snare line and match grip means that you're like a beginner snare line. And as somebody who marched in high school, college, and DCI with traditional grip, like I only play match grip now. It's so limiting to play with this technique. Even though it might look cool or might feel interesting, it's just not as versatile as playing on match grip. A question that you should ask yourself if you are teaching a group is, do you want to teach a bunch of snare drummers or do you want to teach a bunch of percussionists? And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to that, but it just depends on like where you want them to be able to be after they graduate from the line that you're working on. Do you want them to continue to march just on snare and only play snare, or possibly even play traditional on the drum kit? Or do you want them to be able to play other instruments like timpani or marimba or whatever? If you are a percussion instructor who is switching a line over from traditional grip over to match grip, if you march snare specifically with traditional and you make that decision to switch over, then you can get away with it. As long as you have the street cred and the chops to like be able to back up the decision and say, well, educationally, I think it's more valuable for you to learn match grip as opposed to traditional grip. If you are, however, like a tenor player or a marimba player or whatever, and you are the one who's making that decision for your snare line, odds are they are going to think that you just don't know what you're talking about, or that you are not as good as like the other instructors who are teaching traditional grip. That's no knock against you or anything, your abilities, blah, 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 blah. But it's just what I've seen for some students. They will assume that the instructor doesn't know what they're talking about if the snare line is switching from traditional over to match grip. So just be prepared for that. What I do recommend doing is sharing some drum lines like Vanguard 2005. Like if you look up the lot clips from their finals, like their snares are all playing match grip 2005 again, or anything from like Dartmouth or some other WGI groups that are like high school groups that are playing match grip and are just like consistently throwing down and scoring very high every year. If you can share clips of that to show like, look, this world-class group that is consistently performing at the world-class level is playing match grip and has played match grip for years, that can be one of the ways to be able to convince the group to go, oh, maybe it's not like a beginner technique using match grip on snare drum. Maybe it's actually a valuable thing to learn. Another thing to do is to think beyond the label of like a snare drummer. The groups that I worked with, whenever we switched over from traditional to match grip, they mostly bought into it because they were percussionists rather than snare drummers. There was one year where we actually had the snare line swap with the tenor line so that the snares played tenors for a movement and the tenors played snares and vice versa. But we also had for many different years, the battery would actually go into the front ensemble, into the pit and they would play 4 mallets during the ballad. And often the strongest marimba players were in the battery. They were marching in the battery, but they were really good at playing like marimba and other things because, again, we were preparing people to be percussionists and not just drummers. In the spring, we also didn't have a WGI line. Instead, what we had was a variety of percussion ensembles that were both instructor-led by myself and some of the other instructors, or student-led. So the students would meet on their own time, and they would sometimes compose or arrange their own music and work on that on their own. And then we'd perform that in our own separate concert just for percussionists. So it's a great way to get students to be able to learn a variety of instruments. During my undergrad, I was studying with like 4 different people simultaneously on a weekly basis. Learning from multiple different perspectives really accelerated my understanding of not only how to perform, but also how to teach, because they all would say 4 different things on the same topic. And I was like, wait, but they're all still really good at what they do for different reasons. And so it made me realize that like there are many ways to perform, many ways to play, and many ways to teach. And they all work in different ways and for different people. And so having taught every grade, kindergarten through doctoral student, I've also seen across that entire grade span, some techniques or perspectives work for some and not for others. Teaching elementary is for like the bad music educators, and then teaching high school is for the good educators. And it's like, no. Yes, you have to be like at a certain level of musicianship to be able to like do those fine-tune adjustments like to an advanced player. But I would argue it is significantly harder to teach beginners than it is to teach the advanced students, because there's like so many things that you could talk about and like so many different ways that you could introduce things. It's much harder to like introduce the structure of like a content area or the frameworks and like concepts to like guide through without overwhelming a student than it is to refine like, okay, well, let's talk about what you're doing with your thumb and like the amount of pressure in different areas, etc. Like that, like that's easy to do. That's just refinement stuff. Teaching like a kindergartner versus teaching a middle school student or versus like teaching a high school student, they're all so different. And then when I taught like graduate students, like most of the students were like older than me. So it was like funny, like teaching people who were like a decade or 2 older than myself. They were all fun challenges. But one day I was walking back from the band rehearsal. The parking lot in between the 2 spaces was at a decent slope, all on asphalt. The pit was trying to get back fast, and they had these giant carts that held like the vibraphones, the marimbas, etc. on it. They were running with the carts, pushing a cart that had multiple like vibraphones and xylophones on it. And they hit a speed bump, and they hit it in such a way and at such a speed that the vibraphone flipped off of the cart and landed face down on the keys on the asphalt and slid and grinded for multiple feet right in front of where I was walking. What did I do as the instructor in that moment? I watched it, I turned, and I kept walking. Why? Because looking in the eyes of the students that were pushing that cart, it was very clear to me that they had already learned the lesson and they would never do that again, and they never did. Went up to them afterwards and was like, did I need to say anything there? They're like, no, because they realized that they messed up. Now, years later, I went back to that school and was like helping the band director out with like tuning the drums and whatnot. And I went back remembering that story, and I looked at the vibraphones, still scraped on the top of the keys. So sometimes you as the instructor need to say something to be able to like, hey, don't do that again. Other times it's pretty clear, okay, they understood the lesson without me needing to say a single thing.